Sexuality and Gender Now. Introduction. Lisa Hertzman and Juliet Newbegin. There is currently much debate about the varied forms that gender and sexual expression can take. Are we in the grip of a media-induced hysteria that encourages perverse behavior? Or are we finally facing a reality that has been hidden or ignored for years, that both gender and sexuality are far more fluid than we have cared to admit? Psychoanalysis is one of the sites where this debate is taking place, unsurprisingly, in view of the fact that Freud was one of the first to ignite it at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. The book intends to make a contribution in this important area. It would not have been possible without the British Psychoanalytic Council's initiative to break decisively with the troubled history of psychoanalysis' pathological reading of non-heterosexual behavior. For many years, this had led not only to the psychoanalytic treatment of homosexuality as an illness, but also to the exclusion of anyone who had crossed the line sexually from the opportunity to train with one of the institutes that offered courses in psychoanalysis or intensive psychoanalytic psychotherapy. In 2011, a position statement was issued that read, "The BPC does not accept that a homosexual orientation is evidence of disturbance of the mind or in development." Following this, the BPC set up an advisory group to explore ways of making the profession more welcoming to LGBT people, and the group went on to extend its brief to include gender, as well as sexual, diversity. This collection has emerged from this process of opening our thinking. Looking beyond heteronormativity, Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, first published in 1905 and revised several times between then and 1920, show him as simultaneously both radical and conservative in his attitude to sexuality. In the 3 essays, he declares that human sexual behavior can and does take many forms, that homosexuality is found in people whose efficiency is unimpaired, and who are indeed distinguished by specially high intellectual development and ethical culture. 1905d, p. 139. Yet he concludes that the final sexual organization is a heterosexual one. 1905d, footnote p. 207 fn. So, although Freud states in the first essay on the sexual aberrations that the exclusive sexual interest felt by men for women is a problem that needs elucidating, and is not a self-evident fact. 1905d, p. 146 fn, in the third essay, on puberty, he states that the libido, in its mature, procreative state, leads to a search for a partner of the opposite sex. Dana Bergstad-Breen has stated that Freud chose to maintain conflicting ideas on sexuality and saw masculinity and femininity as a conundrum. Bergstad-Breen, 1993a. In this book, we are focusing on contemporary ways of reading this conundrum, taking as our starting point the radical Freud of the sexual aberrations. Our title, Looking Beyond Heteronormativity, follows on from Freud's stated intention in the opening paragraphs of this first essay, to look more closely into the errors, inaccuracies, and hasty conclusions. 1905d, p. 135, that creep in if we leave unquestioned the conventional assumption of heterosexuality as the natural, biologically determined expression of sexuality. As Foucault has described, Freud was one of the pioneering 19th century psychiatrists who developed a new way of observing and classifying human sexual behavior. This was an important time. It is easy to make light of these 19th century psychiatrists who made a point of apologizing for the horrors they were about to let speak, evoking immoral behavior or aberrations of the genetic senses, but I am more inclined to applaud their seriousness. They had a feeling for momentous events. It was a time when the most singular pleasures were called upon to pronounce a discourse of truth concerning themselves, a discourse which had to model itself after that which spoke, not of sin and salvation, but of bodies and life processes, the discourse of science. Foucault, 1976, p. 64. Freud's 3 essays contain some good examples of what Foucault is describing here. In the opening pages of this work he does indeed call upon the most singular pleasures to pronounce their own discourse of scientific truth. Freud was criticized in his own time, for example, by Jung, for having reduced the fundamental life drive, the libido, to a matter of sexuality. From the start of his career as a psychiatrist, Freud studied this aspect of human life and behavior, which was considered shameful and lived out in silence, in spite of being a familiar part of everyone's experience in a society where privacy was usually more limited than we would expect today. Freud came from a respectable Jewish family, but, as Rosemary Balsam, 2017, reminds us, he grew up in a small, crowded apartment, in which he would have been in intimate contact with other members of the family and no stranger to the facts of life, including pregnancy. He writes to Flies of his earliest sexualized memory of his mother with striking delicacy. Later, between the ages of 2 and 2.5, my libido was stirred up towards Matrem, namely on the occasion of a journey with her from Leipzig to Vienna, during which we must have spent the night together and I must have had the opportunity of seeing her new dam. 1950, 1892, 1899, pp. 261-262. In spite of his fastidious language here, Freud went on to become the doctor who spoke fearlessly to his patients, including young women, about their sexual life and fantasies. When we read case histories such as that of Dora, Freud, 1905e, we can feel shocked at Freud's boldness in unhesitatingly speaking to this adolescent girl about what he imagines to be her private and inarticulate thoughts. However, Dora's complex family situation suggests how irregular sexual practices in the bourgeois family could be, and it must have been a dramatic experience for a young woman to come across a doctor who could name sexual matters clearly, even if, in the process, he revealed his own limitations in understanding and empathy. In this book we have collected papers that demonstrate, we hope, an open-minded, inquiring approach to matters of gender and sexuality, one that allows these matters to evoke questions and to speak for themselves. The term heteronormativity may sound like clumsy jargon to some, but it is simply a way of naming the position from which sexuality is conventionally understood. Freud was right in saying that errors, inaccuracies, and hasty conclusions can obscure the view when we assume an expertise that ceases to question our own assumptions, and it has been amply demonstrated that this began to happen in the field of psychoanalysis in the years after Freud. Heterosexuality is encoded in the social, cultural, religious, and economic institutions of our society. And although a more tolerant attitude is developing in our own and other Western countries, those whose gender identity and sexual orientation do not conform to heterosexual norms still experience discrimination and bias. The changes brought in by the 2010 Equality Act that promote equal rights for LGBT+ people may appear to have provided protection against prejudice, but a backlash against political correctness continues to produce undercurrents of homophobia and casual cruelty towards those whose gender and sexuality do not fit with the heteronormativity that some regard as a natural. We would add here that these normative assumptions are still producing misunderstandings, often simply the result of ignorance of other people's lives, that find their way into psychoanalytic theory and clinical practice. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, 1986, has argued that the scientific attitude falls prey to a belief that its knowledge is a view from nowhere, leading its champions to claim that the insights of scientific rationality are the final word on a given area, and he warns us that we forget at our peril that every view is a view from somewhere. Because the Darwinian Freud, who equated heterosexuality with full maturity, has assumed a dominant position in the psychoanalytic field of inquiry, we intend here to present essays on sexuality and gender that name this psychoanalytic heteronormative tendency and look beyond it. This is the first book in the Tavistock Clinic book series on this theme, and, like others in the series, most of the chapters here are by authors working in or influenced by the object relations tradition of psychoanalysis. The book intends to question our psychoanalytic assumptions and unreflective judgments, but we certainly do not claim to provide final answers. The chapters in the section dealing with gender will inevitably be the area where this is most obviously true, as this is an emerging field that poses the starkest challenges for the contemporary psychoanalytic clinician. It is appropriate to think of these papers as celebrating the pioneering work begun by Domenico Di Segli and colleagues in the Gender Identity Development Service, GIDS, at the Tavistock Centre. We hope to show clinicians and their patients facing together the challenges in understanding that emerge in the course of psychotherapy. As the French analyst Colette Chaland said of this area of work, the analyst needs to work on himself or herself as much as on the patient. 2000, p. 33. This collection aims to serve as a training text for students as well as a resource for practicing clinicians. The authors here take a critical approach to conventional theory, deconstructing and extending psychoanalytic concepts. But we believe that what is most important for the clinician is a process of reflective self-awareness, including both unconscious and embodied responses, which attends closely to the transference and countertransference and does not shy away from uncomfortable reactions that may appear prejudicial or pathologizing. This often proves crucial in understanding where significant difficulties lie for both partners in the therapeutic couple, and exploring them may feel risky but will better enable the clinician to survive the dilemmas with which he is presented in treatment. The authors here address these issues, including work with erotic feelings in both transference and countertransference, something clinicians can feel reluctant to acknowledge, but which, if left unaddressed, can limit the possibilities for supporting patients to explore their sexuality and gender more fully. The Oedipus complex. When we speak of deconstructing psychoanalytic concepts, we certainly do not mean that they should be abandoned. The Oedipus complex has occupied a central place in psychoanalytic theory, bringing together three aspects of human experience relevant to our topic, namely, desire, gender identity, and sexuality, across the generations. The earliest evidence in Freud's writing that he was formulating what he later defined as the Oedipus complex occurs in notes that he sent to Flius on the 31st of May 1897, in which he refers to having identified hostile impulses against the parents, a wish that they should die. 1950, 1892, 1899, p. 264. At that time he was engrossed in his self-analysis and had uncovered these wishes in himself, finding in them the origins of his own hysteria. This exploration of his dreams and fantasy life eventually led Freud to abandon his earlier theory that neurosis was the result of an actual seduction in childhood by a parental figure or older sibling. By October of that year, he had found, in the classical story of Oedipus Rex, a mythological representation of the experience of desire for his mother and jealous rivalry with his father that he had recognized in himself. The discovery that this complex of feeling, the child's intense emotional response to the discovery of his parents' sexual relationship, was reflected in a well-known myth from ancient times indicated to him the universality of this experience, we can understand the riveting power of Oedipus Rex, in spite of all the objections raised by reason against its presupposition of destiny. 1950, 1892, 1899, p. 265. By 1910, in the fourth of his 5 lectures on psychoanalysis, he was speaking confidently of the Oedipus complex as an inevitable challenge of individual maturation, and one that constitutes the nuclear complex of every neurosis. 1910a, p. 47. In the 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, 1905d, Freud had outlined his ideas about infantile sexuality. He broadened the meaning of sexuality to encompass all forms of preverbal bodily pleasure of an autoerotic kind, culminating in the genital desire for the parent that resulted in the Oedipal crisis. Subsequently, during latency, these desires became repressed until adolescence reawakened eroticism in a more mature and related form. In Totem and Taboo, he claimed that the origins of the Oedipus complex lay in an inherited memory of mankind's prehistoric trauma. He theorized an early society in which there had been a primal horde, the sons who had been driven out by the violent and jealous father who keeps all the females for himself. Freud, 1912-13, p. 141, who came together and killed and devoured their father. United, they had the courage to do and succeeded in doing what would have been impossible for them individually. p. 141, an echo of this murderous impulse, passed down through the generations, Freud argued, was the phylogenetic origin of Oedipal guilt and the intense anxiety about the possibility of castration. Here, he was intending to build firm foundations for psychoanalysis by rooting them in the emerging scientific disciplines of archaeology and anthropology. However, we no longer accept his idea of phylogenetic memory, and we have come to see his picture of the primal horde as belonging alongside Fraser's Golden Bough, 1894, as something taken seriously at the time but now regarded largely as a work of Eurocentric fantasy about primitive people. Freud's view of the Oedipus complex as based on a scientific view of human infantile development and linked with the evolutionary history of the species has aroused controversy, and as a theory is obviously complicated and contestable. Indeed, it can be argued that it is the nature of Freud's theory, situated as it is on the border between scientific evidence and Freud's unflinchingly honest but subjective examination of his internal life, inevitably inflected with his own unexamined cultural assumptions, that lends it a particular complexity, creating rich possibilities for development in different directions. The various paths these developments have taken have given rise to different schools of psychoanalysis. Freud was initially influenced by Wilhelm Fliess' biologically based ideas about human bisexuality. Fliess, an ear, nose and throat specialist, hypothesized a link between the nose and the genitals and argued for a male equivalent of the female menstrual cycle, lasting 23 days, as opposed to the woman's 28, in Giravisai, 2010, pp. 65-68. Freud adopted Fliess' idea of an innate bisexual disposition, Freud, 1908a, p. 166, but transformed it into a theory of psychological masculinity and femininity. He developed an account of the Oedipus complex that was firmly rooted in the boy's experience of his anatomy, assuming that the significance accorded to the penis reflected the natural cultural superiority accorded to masculinity, active, dominant, over femininity, passive, receptive. For the boy, and particularly for Freud, the oldest son of a mother who adored him, this account appeared objectively coherent. His anatomy destined him to move from his earliest intense love affair with his mother, through castration anxiety and painful submission to his father's authority, to arrive at identification with him, accepting his father's superior status but comforted by the prospect that in the future he would possess a woman of his own. But Freud also suggested that the boy, before settling on this positive, Oedipal outcome, could also experience the complex in a negative form, a homosexual desire to be sexually dominated by his father, in which he was the passive partner, subjectively identified with his mother. This picture, while involving the boy's fantasy about the function of his penis, is further complicated by Freud's assertion that the boy assumes his mother to possess a penis like himself. It is the discovery that this is not so that provokes the Oedipal crisis, initiating castration anxiety and facing him with his guilty recognition of his sexual wishes towards his mother. Freud later developed his ideas about the Oedipal situation of women, 1931b, 1933a, to correct his earlier mistaken assumption that the girl's development was simply the mirror image of the boy's. The work of other colleagues, particularly women analysts, had led him to recognize that both girl and boy shared the mother as their earliest love object. It is here that Freud moves further from observed anatomy into the territory of subjective meaning, when he asserts that the girl does not recognize her vagina, but only her clitoris, which she assumes to be a penis. In fact, she sees herself as a little man, and assumes that her mother is similarly equipped. Like the boy, it is the discovery of this mistake that ushers in her Oedipal crisis, leading her to reject her mother in disgust and resolving her envy of the penis she lacks by turning to her father, who will give her a baby, preferably a male child, in compensation. As previously noted, in spite of his belief in this phallocentric fantasy of narcissistic completeness and the polymorphously perverse sensual pleasures that prevail in early infancy, Freud required the genital stage of development, which initiates the complex, to come to a heterosexual resolution, though positive, outcome. Underlying this assumption was his Darwinian view that the dominant function of sexuality was to ensure the survival of the species. At this point, the contrasexual or negative aspect of the complex became repressed and consigned to the unconscious, in service of the requirement that each individual prepare him or herself to play the part assigned by their biological sex. Successfully negotiated Oedipal development allowed the complex to dissolve. Failure to complete the process led to neurosis. There is a great deal of literature in psychoanalysis drawing out different aspects implicit in Freud's picture, giving rise to specific schools of psychoanalysis. There are those that have pursued Freud's view of his discipline as a science. Much work has been done on child development to find supporting evidence based on observation that elaborates Freud's theories. Anna Freud herself, Melanie Klein, Donald Winnicott, and Margaret Marlar all worked with children and extended Freud's ideas very creatively. Currently, the work of the Boston Change Process Study Group, arising from the work of the neonatal psychologist Daniel Stern, is observing minutely the way infant and caregiver develop emotionally entrained preverbal communication. Most psychoanalytic trainings in the United Kingdom require the candidate to undertake an infant observation in order to develop attunement to children during their earliest stages of development, on the understanding that such close attention informs the therapist's sensitivity to the patient's infantile and preverbal experience. There have also been, from the outset, colleagues of Freud's who contested his assumption of the primacy of the phallus and his argument that the pre-Oedipal girl has no knowledge of her vagina and its function. Beginning with Karen Horney and Helen Deutsch, there were analysts, mainly women, who argued that anatomy is destiny, but assumed women's innate knowledge of their biological capacity. Women may lack a penis, but they can bear children. They claimed that it was possible to define essential differences between male and female psychology based on observable physical differences, but without the phallocentrism assumed by Freud. Melanie Klein, who situated Oedipal development at a much earlier stage and took for granted the infant's innate awareness of his or her anatomy, has contributed to these ideas. These participants in the psychoanalytic discussion of gender and sexuality have offered creative insight into how women's experience is informed by their bodily reality, notably of menstruation and childbirth, and the intimate links between mothers and daughters. It is a line of thinking that further develops Freud's ideas about psychic bisexuality and is being currently explored fruitfully by the Committee on Women and Psychoanalysis, CAWAP, of the International Psychoanalytical Association. In the United Kingdom, Kleinian psychoanalysts have developed a line of psychoanalytic thinking that has foregrounded the Oedipal stage as the development of an acceptance of reality, leaving its implications for bodily awareness somewhat obscured. This approach, which draws particularly on the ideas of Melanie Klein, Hannah Siegel, and Wilfred Bion, focuses on the capacity for tolerance of the so-called third position, an Oedipus complex of the mind that recognizes the separation from a primal unity of mother and infant and introduces the capacity for reality testing and reflection. These developments have been central to the Tavistock tradition. Monikil, 1971, described how the Oedipus complex establishes three crucial facts of life: the fact of gender difference, the fact of generational difference, and the required deferment of gratification. This creative line of thought has been taken further by subsequent thinkers, including Herbert Rosenfeld, Betty Joseph, Ron Britton, and John Steiner. It has travelled abroad and has impacted on Roy Scaffer and Thomas Upton in the United States. In the United Kingdom, it is perhaps one of the reasons why interest in the implications of Freud's ideas about sexual development as such has waned, and there has been an increased focus on the here and now exchange in the analytic encounter. Alongside those schools that maintain the scientific inheritance of Freud's work, there has been ongoing interest in developing his subjectivist viewpoint, which is particularly engaged with his thinking about sexual identity. This perspective recognizes the body's existence as a fantasy construction that can include the assumptions that the mother shares a penis and that the little girl is a little man, ideas that may seem true to a child but come from somewhere other than physical reality. This reading of Freud has been given traction by the work of Lacan, which has been influential in academia. Lacan's Freud is understood from a phenomenological perspective, which recognizes the crucial contribution of the social context in which we develop our sense of identity. Although Freud did not recognize it himself, the Oedipus complex in his own account can be read as a description of the child's earliest introduction to the world interpreted through the cultural construction of sexual difference, the dominance of a masculine values, and the repudiation of femininity 1937 c, which the child takes in as he or she attempts to decode the social meaning of bodily treatment and family dynamics. Other French analysts are significant here, such as Jean Laplanche, 1997, who stresses the asymmetrical nature of the child-parent relationship, and Janine Chasquetz-Magel, 1985b, and Bella Grunberger, 1989, who argued, like Monikil, that the Oedipus complex introduced the child to the fact of generational, as well as sexual, difference. All these schools aim, in different ways, to develop Freud's ideas about what are essential aspects of human behavior and experience, which Freud described as scientific truths that were being uncovered by psychoanalysis. Perhaps for this reason, the language in which these developing theories were expressed has tended to lead to their being construed as facts, which have been at times misused to claim the moral high ground in debates about the correct view. Milton, 2000, in relation to gender and sexuality. Deconstruction, as we use it here, refers to the attempt to develop an understanding of the evolving history of psychoanalytic ideas and the truth claims that they make. The book These Multiple Ways of Developing the Theory of Freud's Oedipus Complex demonstrate how it can be read as the crucible of our unstable sense of our identity. In placing sex at the heart of psychic development, Freud highlighted its capacity to destabilize the psyche, requiring each individual to develop her/his defenses to deal with the power of this drive. His work maintained in sharp focus a connection between psychoanalysis and the physical body, in both its material and its fantasy form, a conundrum that it is difficult to keep in view. As Nancy Chodorow, 1992, has pointed out, the developmental history of everyone's sexuality, whatever their orientation, should be understood as a compromise formation. We advocate here a position that recognizes the contradictions we inevitably face in trying to theorize our own internal world. For us, the scientific achievement of psychoanalysis is the development of a particular kind of attention and reflection in a special setting. Although we need theory to think within, it can foreclose further questioning if we allow it to take primacy in dictating our understanding of what we see. We hope that the reader will be able to find congruence with the not-knowing, open stance we have tried to convey here, without memory or desire. Bion, 1967. This frequently quoted line advocates an attitude that is, of course, impossible to achieve but indicates an approach where theories and assumptions are not adhered to rigidly, allowing the clinician to engage more directly with the patient's dilemmas and conflicts. We believe that this psychoanalytic stance can enable an openness to the atypical developmental trajectory of relationships for those whose sexuality and gender may be fluid, and to think about the place of them in the mind. Developing a wider and more flexible attitude to sexuality in general could illuminate our understanding of all sexualities, including heterosexuality, in addressing the internal experience of individuals who are forming their own identities in our rapidly changing world. The book is written both for clinicians involved in training and supervising students in psychoanalytic settings, as well as for students themselves. We are aware that practicing clinicians may not have had the opportunity to explore sexuality and gender more widely in their original trainings, and may want to develop a greater depth of understanding. We hope it will be of interest to clinicians, supervisors, teachers, academics, and students in the fields of psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic psychotherapy, psychodynamic counseling and therapy, couple and family psychoanalysis, and child psychotherapy and analysis. The chapters and authors. These collected chapters that comprise the book contain a selection of new essays, alongside several by authors who have already had a significant impact on the development of psychoanalytic theory and practice. All the authors in this book have endeavored to develop new ways of extending psychoanalytic theories, always informed by the clinical experience, with patients at the center. They include clinicians working with a wide range of populations in settings in both the medical and the voluntary sector, but also educators in psychoanalysis, committed to teaching, supervising, and training coming generations of psychotherapists. The authors of these collected essays on issues of gender and sexuality represent a range of theoretical standpoints, which include object relations, Kleinian and Freudian, those of French psychoanalysis, post-Jungian, and queer theory. Part I. Sex and the Consulting Room. Juliet Newbegin explores how the development of psychoanalysis in the English-speaking world has foregrounded infant-caregiver relationships and relegated erotic experience to a less prominent position than Freud proposed. She explores the work of Laplanche and of others influenced by his thinking who emphasize the unmirrored and enigmatic nature of sexual excitement. She suggests that the unexplored heteronormative bias of psychoanalytic clinicians has led to a neglect of the therapist's own psychosexuality, leading to an unconsidered judgmental stance on the normative sexual behavior. Her chapter emphasizes the need for a greater openness to our patients' sexuality from a perspective that is informed by the clinician's own experience of erotic desire. Paul Rolliter draws on psychosocial research outside the psychoanalytic field that demonstrates the shame-inducing impact of homophobia on the development of a boy who grows up with an awareness of a gay identity. He explores the psychoanalytic literature on shame and, drawing on clinical and cultural examples, demonstrates the defensive behavior that underlying shame can produce, which can include a paradoxical hypermasculinity. He suggests that it is the aspects of a gay man's identity that are associated with vulnerability and weakness that are particularly shame-inducing, as they evoke a misogynistic fear of becoming like a woman. These feelings and their link with internalized homophobia can be difficult to address in therapy but should not be avoided, as they have inevitable consequences for the patient's self-esteem. David Richards' chapter is a significant contribution to a discussion that barely exists as yet, about the impact on the supervisory relationship of an awareness of diverse sexuality. Richards considers the impact on the supervisee, gay or straight, of the supervisor's sexuality, if it is known or intuited from the context in which the work takes place. Because of the silence about sexual orientation that psychoanalysis has required of its practitioners, Richard suggests that sexuality, as an aspect of the clinician's lived experience, has come to be ignored. He describes the effect that it can have when it becomes available for lively consideration in the supervisory context. He considers the various settings in which clinical work takes place and the particular impact that these settings may have on the supervisory dynamic. Part 2. Desire. These chapters address the use and relevance of the Oedipus concept in its classical depiction of desire and challenge the traditional heteronormative use of the concept. The authors address, in different ways, how desires develop across time and how the trajectory of early infantile sexuality can persist in the mind and the body in adult relational life. Lisa Hertzman explores how the loss of the unconscious Oedipal mother can be manifested as a loss of sexual desire in a couple's relationship. Her paper is focused on women's desire for women, but she also considers the relevance of these ideas for other gender relationship pairings and how crucial it can be for couples to understand and acknowledge a wide range of identifications with, and desire for, both genders. The move from a fantasy state of merger and a wish to possess the Oedipal mother to a more reality-based relationship can induce feelings of abandonment and loss, particularly of sexual desire. She suggests that to transcend sexual and gender binaries, gender and sexual fluidity should be acknowledged in therapy and can contribute to enhanced awareness of the desires of all our patients, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Diana Lees is a senior and influential figure in psychoanalysis in the United States. She has written extensively on gender, sexual orientation, sexuality, inhibited desire, and infidelity, as well as on other issues such as creativity and aging. In this chapter, she also examines the classical version of the female Oedipal complex in order to elucidate aspects of same-sex object choice. Elise explores whether a mother can see her daughter as a sexual subject and whether mother-daughter homoerotic desire can be experienced and validated by the mother. She suggests that the fate of eroticism in the early mother-daughter relationship can obscure female desire, and she proposes the relabeling of the negative Oedipal complex in girls as the primary maternal Oedipal situation. She emphasizes that female desire, what she wants and that she wants, is rendered invisible by heterosexual structures that psychoanalytic theories have, until more recently, all too readily accepted without question. She makes clear that she is referring to qualities in the mind, not proposing that, in actuality, people need to live bisexual lives, and in this sense she remains close to Freud's ideas on psychic bisexuality. Giorgio Gagliardi writes about the effect on gay men of the lack, or inadequacy, of symbolic representations for their desire. Drawing on a rich range of sources, which include psychoanalysis and post-Jungian and queer theory, he describes how gay men have had to create forms of relationship in which they can find themselves and their desire reflected. His account promotes a sympathetic understanding of the need that drives this search, which arises from an internal deficit that can permanently undermine a sense of wholeness for the individual. He argues, nevertheless, that the creative work of improvisation can be reparative and has a considerable contribution to make to the wider culture. Part 3. Perspectives on Gender. In this part, the chapters consider gender and gender identity. They will inevitably present a challenge to historical psychoanalytic ways of theorizing this area. These authors write from clinical experience and demonstrate their own struggles to question their own assumptions. Jack Dreisker is a senior figure in psychiatry and psychoanalysis in the United States. He has made significant contributions to ways of thinking more open-mindedly about gender and has been actively engaged in the negotiations to arrive at the psychiatric classification of gender dysphoria. Here he begins by describing his own early encounter with an intersex patient to demonstrate how the biological evidence of gender nonconformity that such patients exhibited was routinely eliminated through surgery to enable them to occupy a place in the natural gender binary. His chapter takes the reader systematically through the terms involved in the classification of gender and sexuality, explaining, as he goes, their history and the development of the ongoing debate about gender and sexual variance, including the narrative provided by psychoanalysis. He suggests that everyone, including therapists, has his /her own internal system of what constitutes naturally acceptable and unacceptable sexual and gender expression, arranged hierarchically, and he points out how important it is for clinicians to be aware of their own. What analysts hear through their own filters may inevitably affect the kind of interventions they do and do not make with patients. Bernadette Wren describes the work of the Gender Identity Development Service, GIDS, which is the one NHS highly specialist service in England and Wales for children and adolescents. She addresses the quandaries around gender diversity urgently facing children, parents, carers, GIDS clinicians, and NHS commissioners, and how pressing questions arise for clinicians attempting to find their feet with these young people and their families. She describes how difficult it can be to make sense of their unhappiness and how challenging it can be to address their struggles imaginatively, compassionately, and safely. There are, as yet, few published papers that illuminate how a service operates at the center of this whirlwind in a highly contested area. While politicization of gender identity in children proceeds unabated, and arguments about professional practice are regular news events, the voices of the clinicians rarely heard. This chapter is not a personal record of this anxious, watchful clinical work but, rather, one in which Wren outlines how these responsibilities are thought about and managed, as well as describing some of the impacts of the disputatious on the work. She illustrates the way that GID sits at the heart of a set of contested issues of our time. Melanie Suchet has been the recipient of 2 significant awards for her work in psychoanalysis by the American Psychological Association, and she is also on the editorial board of several journals. This seminal chapter describes her work with a patient who, through a long process of analytic exploration, came to choose to transition from female to male. The chapter attempts to replicate Suchet's experience of the work, the sense of uncertainty, of not knowing, and having to stay in the dark and let things emerge organically. Suchet, Personal Communication, August 2018. It also resonates with the patient's experience of living with and through the uncertainty of gender and sexuality to reach a place of greater understanding and acceptance. Suchet describes undergoing her own process of change, re-evaluating her relationship to psychoanalytic theories and concepts and issues of technique. She comes to a different understanding of the body and the central issues of how to own and inhabit and body that have not been sufficiently theorized in the psychoanalytic literature. A person beyond gender. This chapter is an account by a patient. We felt it important to be reminded how these issues of gender, so delicate and often so anxiety-provoking for the professional, can seem to the person who is undergoing them. We are grateful to the author for letting us use his account of his experience as a trans man who spent many years depressed and confused by a baffling sense of wrongness and difference from those around him. He makes no claim to have found a magic solution, but his moving story conveys vividly the reality of one person's honest attempt, with the help of a therapist, to confront the issues. It is longer than the other chapters, but we felt it justifies its length. Ken Corbett is an influential figure in psychoanalysis the United States, drawing on his wide experience of working with gender variant children to question the impact that normative developmental expectations have had on nonconforming boys in particular. Here, he argues for a model of development that does not adhere rigidly to the picture that is reflected in the Oedipus complex, but one that makes room for expressions of gender that are individual and unexpectable. He describes gender and bodily coherence as an intricate lattice work, too complex for simplistic causality. He invites us to question our tendency to equate gender variance with pathology, in order to maintain an open mind and a therapeutic capacity to listen to the other's experience. He says, we struggle still to find a way to speak about non-normative genders outside a split that moves between phobia and advocacy. We have been too quick to categorize, too quick to diagnose, and insufficiently attentive to the complex and perplexed relations established between individuals and cultural mandates. A note about patient confidentiality. The chapters in this book contain a variety of clinical examples that have been approached in different ways. Some are fictional, some are composite case examples, and some are from patients or supervisors whose consent has been given to include their material. Above all, the authors of these chapters have considered the issue of confidentiality with the utmost care and thought. Readers of this book may like to be aware that Melanie Suchet's chapter was written with her patient's consent and involvement. She said about this process, as an analyst one has to be very careful about the timing of when to write a piece. It feels to me that only when coming to an end does it feel less of an interference and less likely to feel exploitative. She explained that she was greatly encouraged by Raphael, who has told her how helpful the paper has been for him. He said that he has read it many times, as a way to remember who he was and as a way to remember his struggles. He moved to a different city, and, when comfortable with his new therapist, he allowed her to read the paper and get a sense of all the work he has done.